Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And welcome to another edition of Sabbath Sunday. This is where Darren and I get together with you to talk all things Black Sabbath. Darren and I have a Black Sabbath podcast called Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, where we go chronologically through the Sabbath, as well as the Ozzy and the Dio solo albums. I will leave a link in the description down below so you can check out our podcast. But the topic for today's episode is we are going to give you what we believe to be the quintessential Black Sabbath album. Now, I want to read the definition of quintessential to everyone out there so they get a feel of the thinking that we were using for this, because it isn't necessarily their biggest selling album or their most well-known or whatever, but here's the definition. Quintessential, representing the most perfect or typical example of a quality or a class. So something that represents the most perfect or typical example of Black Sabbath, you could say. So Darren, what is your quintessential Black Sabbath album?
Well, it's like you said, it should represent, it should be in my opinion, the archetypal representation of the band. I'm not saying it's the best, because that's subjective. Everybody who's a Black Sabbath fan probably has their own opinion of what they consider to be the best Black Sabbath album. But for me, I decided to go with Master of Reality. For me, it checks all the boxes. It's dark, it's heavy, production's great. And when I say the production's great, I don't mean that it's really an expensive, elaborate production. It's fairly basic, but it's really effective. Everything is balanced well. Tony Iommi's guitar tone is probably the best on any album. Again, this is my opinion, but this to me is the best example of Tony Iommi's thick, heavy guitar tone. Ozzy's voice sounds great. The songs are great. And now, I mean, you're going to go with what would be the most popular Black Sabbath album, you'd probably have to go with Paranoid, because you have Iron Man, Paranoid, Fairies Wear Boots. And this album doesn't have any of the big hits, although, I mean, I guess you could consider Sweet Leaf a big hit, Children of the Grave, but it has a continuity throughout that I think just really exemplifies what I find to be the most attractive about Black Sabbath. The melodies, the heavy riffs, the production. It's a very dark production, but it's very audible. I like the cover. It's just iconic. I love that swirly font, letter form thing. The embossed thing in the front is very like 70s, is when there was a lot of attention paid to detail for album covers. Sometimes gatefolds, and they still have gatefolds now, but sometimes, like a Zeppelin 3, you had the wheel, small faces, you had like the mouth that you could move. There was a lot of emphasis on the album covers, and this is no exception. I love the embossed letters, the texture. So it's a fun album to have, the album cover, and then when you open it up, of course, and I'm not sure if they've done this with the reissues, but you get the poster saturated in green, kind of gives you another, that's the only time you see the band. The lyrics are on the back, which is kind of unusual, but it's pretty cool. Is if there's any doubt that Black Sabbath were kind of a dark band, you can read the lyrics, see for yourself. It's right there. So yeah, I mean, I consider this the quintessential Black Sabbath album. And if I was going to tell somebody, and we've talked about this before in our podcast and maybe one or two of our videos, but I used to say, well, if somebody came to me and asked me, I had never heard Black Sabbath before, what album should I get? I would probably tell them to check out Iron Man. But I've come away from that a bit, and I'm going off the assumption that they probably already heard Iron Man and Paranoid, and maybe that's what piqued their curiosity about Black Sabbath. So I think in this case, I would give them something to get them a little bit further into Black Sabbath. and this would be the album. Is the one that I think that say, okay, well, you've heard the hits, you've heard the songs on the radio. Now, this is something that you can really sink your teeth into. This is something you can really dig into and get like a real, you know, feel for Black Sabbath. So, Black Sabbath, Master of Reality, the quintessential Black Sabbath album, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good pick. You can't argue with that. And if I was picking a quintessential for the Ozzy era, I would have definitely have picked Master of Reality, because to me, even though Paranoid is it's the biggest seller, it's got the quote hits on it and everything. I think that Master of Reality just represents a little bit more of what Black Sabbath would become and where they came from, where they were going. It's a great sort of pivoting transitional record. But I took a little bit of a different view on it. I kind of wanted to imagine the entire Black Sabbath catalog, everything that Black Sabbath is about. And this is tricky because Black Sabbath, even within the Ozzy era, they changed a lot. Pretty much every album is different.
Every album was different. Yeah.
Every album was different. You had the different singers then with Dio and Glenn Hughes and Ian Gillan and Tony Martin. So there's a lot of different eras of Black Sabbath, and Black Sabbath can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for me, I went with my quintessential album, I picked Mob Rules. And I picked Mob Rules because I kind of feel like if you were somebody who had never heard any Black Sabbath and you came in on that album, there's moments that do harken a little bit back to the past. You've got a little bit of the grooviness, like a voodoo, that bluesy driving thing that Sabbath is so good at. Slipping Away is kind of a jammy type number, which reminds me of what they were doing like early with Ozzy, like Rat Salad. It sounded like they were just in studio jams type of thing. So you have a little bit of that, but you also have, of course, with the stuff that represents the Dio era, things that feel like they could have landed in the Tony Martin era, something like, Falling Off the Edge of the World. I mean, it's hard to imagine Dio not singing these songs, but Turn Up the Night, is a hard driving rocker and everything. So I could picture some of this. If somebody came in on this album and then their next album was a Tony Martin album, they went to Headless Cross after this, it would certainly be different, but I don't think it would be that crazy of a shift for them. They'd be able to make some connections. If they were to jump back to Technical Ecstasy or something like that, or Sabotage, they can make some connections to Mob Rules. Over and Over is a great, blues, doomy blues type of thing that they did so well in during the Ozzy era. So I kind of feel E5150 is the experimental noise thing that they always seem to have often had a little instrumental, a guitar instrumental or a sound effect thing like FX on Volume 4, weird little experimental things like that. So I think there's a little bit of everything here. The only thing maybe it lacks is a ballad, which they were pretty good at, or mellow tunes, or ballads, like mellow as in like Planet Caravan or Solitude, ballad as in like She's Gone. You don't really get that on here, but you do get like the intro to Sign of the Southern Cross is kind of mellow, the acoustic guitars, that middle section in Country Girl, the beginning of Falling Off the Edge of the World. So you do get a little bit of that spooky mellow vibe too. But I just kind of felt like if it was somebody who had never heard Black Sabbath before and I didn't know what record they were going to pick next after this record, and I didn't have any influence over it, I would say, all right, start here. And I think if you like this album, you're some things you'll like. You'll probably like the Ozzy era, but you'll probably also like the Tony Martin era, because there is some connections, in my opinion, between those. So
Yeah.
my quintessential is Mob Rules. And this is hard because when you think of Black Sabbath, I mean, really Ozzy is the quintessential singer of Black Sabbath, the voice of Black Sabbath. But again, I kind of took it like if somebody just walked in and they were like, I don't know anything about Black Sabbath. I just heard somebody tell me I got to listen to Black Sabbath. And they knew nothing about an alien landed from another planet or something. I could do that. If you're anybody with any kind of history about the band, it's hard not to, pick something from the Ozzy era, because Ozzy is so much, as great as Dio is, and as great as all the singers in Black Sabbath have been, because Ozzy was the first,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's true. And that was one of the things that I based my decision on was Ozzy, and having that classic sound, that mournful tone that Ozzy has. And sometimes he's ready to party, he's got that voice that just it's fun. But more often it's like when I first heard Ozzy's voice, it sounded like it was somebody singing who was on the verge of tears.
Yeah.
And that really struck a chord with me. But it isn't all about Ozzy either. The problem with mob rules, and I have no problem with mob rules, but the problem with it in the context of this conversation is, I mean, I love mob rules. I've said I think it's the best heavy metal album of all time, and I stand by that. I love the album. I can listen to it anytime. I love it. But as far as it being the quintessential Black Sabbath album, can't really go that far because we don't have Bill Ward. I think Bill Ward, in addition to Ozzy, Bill Ward
Yeah.
really made a big impact, really shaped the sound of the band. I mean, his jazzy style, the way he would dance around the rhythm on
Yeah.
a lot of swing. I think Bill Ward is such an underrated drummer, and I think he had just as much to do with shaping the band's sound as anybody else in the band. But on Master of Reality, you don't just have Ozzy. We could say, oh, Ozzy's voice, and he established Black Sabbath, and it was those first albums that really put them on the map, and that's true. But on Master of Reality, I love Geezer's bass tone. It's mixed so well, you could hear it.
Thunder.
I love it. I love it. Tony's riffs are sick, for lack of a better word.
Oh,
The
yeah.
tone, the leads. I mean, those messy leads. As time went on, he got a lot better. But there's a lot of charm in those leads, those double track leads that are just sort of all sporadic and all over the place. But it's such a big part because you have the weight of the songs and the heavy riffage, and then this lead is just like splashed somewhere in the middle of the song. That to me became such a trademark aspect of Black Sabbath's music. And so, you've got Geezer's bass, you've got the presence of Bill Ward and his style, and how essential it is to the way these songs sound, and how unique the band sounded against anything else that was coming out at the time. Bill Ward had just as much to do with it as Ozzy and Geezer and Tony.
Yeah.
And
That
so
crossed my mind when I was doing this. I was thinking about Bill, and I almost went with Heaven and Hell, but I kind of felt like
he's not really that audible.
it's not as much Bill that we talked about this, I think, on the podcast or maybe here.
Yeah.
Where I said, it's hard to even, it doesn't always feel like it's even Bill on that record. It isn't until really, for me, Lonely Is the Word is the only song that really makes me feel like it really engaged Bill. But I understand that. And I understand, I really think that the secret, if you were to talk about, what makes the sound of Black Sabbath to somebody who maybe just knows the band on a surface level, they would immediately say Ozzy. Okay, Ozzy's voice.
So whatever hits your ear first.
Right, exactly. It's so unique, and it has such a certain tone to it. But I really think the secret sauce in Black Sabbath, the secret ingredient, is the rhythm section and their feel. It's much akin to AC/DC. AC/DC has a swing to what they do. Black Sabbath has that also. And there was something about the chemistry when Bill and Geezer, when all four of those guys were, if we're just talking about the rhythm section, let's just say, Tony, Geezer, and Bill, when those three are there, there's like this, they're almost working on a psychic level or something, the way they're able to do these, I always think there's a video of Henry Rollins talking about Iron Man, And he talks about, listen to that part in the song where they're coming out of the guitar solo and it goes bum 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 ba da 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 bum
Boom, boom,
ba da da ba
yeah,
da da. He's
yeah,
like,
he's right.
that's just like,
It's like
yeah,
something they
you know
just
that they
could
didn't
feel each
talk
other.
about
Yeah,
that. It isn't
yeah,
like they sat down and they talked. They didn't talk about that. They didn't have to rehearse it for months on end to
no,
get it. I'm sure that they never even thought about it. It just happened because they have that feel, and trying to,
yeah,
no other, it only happens when those guys are all together.
yeah,
You don't get that feel from the Dio era, from any other era. That disappeared. That element disappears from the band.
right.
That sort of being able to shift in and out of those tempo changes, and not that they don't have tempo changes later on, but this ability to go from a straight ahead thing to like a swing thing, like in a Lord of this World. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's another one. It's just like this. It's not. It's a little bit of a tempo change, but it's really a feel change.
It's a field change.
And
Yeah,
they were so
you're
good
on it.
at doing
Yeah,
that kind of, and that's their blues and jazz influence in their
yeah,
sound. Their ability to go from straight to like a swingy type of thing,
uh-huh.
and they were able to just turn that on and off at
They do.
will.
I know. And Bill Ward really drives a lot of those changes.
Yeah,
It's like he's conducting it, especially on Master of Reality, especially on Master of Reality. But again, I mean, on Paranoid, going back to Paranoid is when you really start to feel like the band has total cohesion. Um, the first album's pretty loose, it's pretty bluesy, it's definitely heavy, but I mean, but even at that time, so you take the first album, you're going all the way up to Master of Reality. You got to keep in mind, like you're saying, well, and I agree that, well, they seem to have like they're kind of mentally linked into one another when it comes to playing together as a band. But you got to remember, I mean, they're playing like two gigs a day.
yeah,
They're practicing constantly all the time, and they're either sleeping or they're playing or they're
they're living
partying or whatever.
together.
But there's a lot of time spent, feeding off of one another, playing with each other,
Yeah,
getting, completely synced up with one another's styles, and almost to the point where they at this point, even on the third album, 1971, uh, you got to think that they've probably been playing together, have done so many shows at this point that they can predict what one another is going to do. And that's a lot of the reason I think that it sounds like Bill Ward is actually leading some of these changes. And you get into like
yeah,
Lord of this World, Into the Void, and that we get some of the grooves down, 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 it's like that.
yeah, yeah. That's another example.
Bum, 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 and it's stop on a dime, and it's just totally in sync. And that's something that I don't think, and you said it too, that while the professionalism and the song craft, the heaviness, and everything that goes into uh, the albums past the Ozzy era are undeniable, but there's something magical about those early, I mean, I
Yeah,
love all the Black Sabbath albums. Yeah. The- but I mean, when you talk about the first three, the four albums, maybe just the first three, things started to get a little bit more involved with the production end of things, but um, you really hear a band that is just so well integrated with one another. And I think that that's
yeah,
one of the things that as a quintessential album that I would want people to try to hear and pick out and try to understand, because I think it's
yeah.
really, it's a unique quality that I don't think it's really been revisited as such so much at any point after that.
I
So,
agree.
yeah.
All right, there you go. There's our quintessential albums. Let us know what you think of our picks. Let us know what your pick is down below for the quintessential Black Sabbath album. Make sure you check out our podcast, linked in the description down there, and we will see you at the next Sabbath Sunday.